In the spring of 1870, a federal marshal riding solo through the Choctaw Nation stumbled upon the 17 corpses arranged in a flawless ring around a dying campfire. Every man had been shot once between the eyes, and each clutched a single playing card from the same deck in his cold hand. The marshal tallied the cards twice before the realization hit him. The fallen were a mix of Pinkerton agents, Texas Rangers, bounty hunters, and 3 deputies from his own office in Fort Smith, Arkansas. They had ridden out together 6 weeks prior with one objective: to capture or kill the man newspapers were calling the Black Devil of the Red River. They had failed, just as every posse before them had failed. The cards in their hands formed a coded message, one the marshal recognized but couldn't decipher. A code that wouldn't be cracked for another 41 years, long after anyone who knew its meaning had died and been buried in nameless graves scattered across 3 states and the Indian Territory. What the marshal didn't know, what no white lawman would grasp for decades, was that the man they hunted had once been property, sold at auction in Natchez, Mississippi, for $940 to a cotton planter. That planter had branded him on the left shoulder with the initials JW, before putting him to work in the fields at age 11. Before we continue with the tale of Jeremiah Walker and the gang that nearly toppled the United States government in the years after the Civil War, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me which state you're listening from tonight, because what you're about to hear was locked away in classified federal files for over a century, and the descendants of the men involved are still living in towns from Oklahoma to East Texas. They never wanted this story told. Tonight, we're telling it anyway, to understand how an ex-slave came to lead the most terrifying outlaw band in American frontier history. You have to understand the nation that shaped him, a nation that had just ripped itself apart over whether men like him were human beings or commodities. The war ended in April 1865. But along the western edge of the former Confederacy, in the borderlands where Texas met the Indian Territory and the Indian Territory met Arkansas, the war never truly ceased. It merely transformed. The Union Army pulled most of its troops to occupy the Deep South, leaving behind a sprawling, lawless region nearly the size of France with fewer than 200 federal officers to enforce order. Into that vacuum flooded every desperate soul the war had spawned. Confederate guerrillas who wouldn't surrender, Union deserters wanted for murder in 3 states, Comanche and Kiowa raiders forced off their hunting grounds, Mexican vaqueros displaced by new Anglo cattle barons, Chinese laborers who'd finished the railroads and found themselves alone in a country that despised them, and tens of thousands of freedmen, emancipated with nowhere to go and nothing to their names, walking west with only the clothes on their backs, because the South they'd known had become a killing ground for any black man caught alone after dark. The town of Boggy Depot sat near the center of this chaos in the Choctaw Nation, about 40 miles north of the Red River. And in the autumn of 1866, it was the sort of place where a man could buy a meal, a horse, or another man's life for roughly the same price. The streets were unpaved, and the buildings had been thrown together from green cottonwood that warped and split as it dried, giving every door and window a crooked look, as if the town itself had been built by a drunk who couldn't recall how houses were supposed to fit together. There were 3 saloons, 2 owned by the same Choctaw merchant named Pushmataha Folsom, a descendant of a famous chief who'd grown rich selling whiskey to soldiers during the war. He saw no reason to stop selling it to outlaws now that the soldiers had gone home. There was a single store run by a Scottish trader named Angus McRae, who kept a loaded shotgun under the counter and a Bible on top, and who was known to settle disputes with whichever he could grab first. There was a livery stable, a blacksmith, and a small adobe building that served as both jail and courthouse for whatever rough justice the Choctaw Lithersmen could dispense when they bothered to ride through, which was happening less and less as the region sank deeper into chaos. Boggy Depot that autumn was less a town than a wound that had begun to scar over, without healing properly underneath. Wagons rolled in at all hours from the south, from Texas, carrying men who wouldn't give their names and goods, whose origins no one asked about. Wagons rolled out at all hours toward the north, toward Fort Smith, carrying things that had once belonged to someone else. The graveyard at the edge of town, on a small rise behind the Methodist mission abandoned since 1863, had grown by 47 new graves in the 18 months since the war ended. Only 9 of them belonged to people who died of natural causes. The rest had perished, as the saying went in that country, from lead poisoning or rope fever, or the kind of accident involving a knife, a back, and a moonless night. The Choctaw Light Horsemen, a small force of mounted lawmen, authorized by treaty to keep order in the nation, had ridden through twice in the year before. Both times after killings serious enough to embarrass the tribal government in Tuskahoma. Both times they'd questioned a few witnesses, found nothing, and ridden off again, leaving Boggy Depot to settle its own scores in its own way. The mission building still stood at the western edge of town, its roof half collapsed, the heavy oak doors hanging open. And inside the town's children, and those of passing strangers, played among the broken pews and shattered pulpit, occasionally finding a torn hymn page or a fragment of stained glass someone had thought worth shooting at. The town's smell was unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time in such places. A mix of horse manure, wood smoke, unwashed wool, and cheap whiskey. Beneath it all, the faint but persistent odor of old blood soaked into the earth of certain alleys, impossible to wash out with any amount of rain. Into this town on a cold November morning in 1866 walked a black man of about 20, standing 6'2", lean as a coyote, wearing a Union Army cavalry coat with a corporal's chevrons still sewn to the sleeve and a wide, brimmed slouch hat pulled low over eyes the color of wet slate. He carried a Spencer repeating carbine slung across his back, 2 Colt Army revolvers at his hips in a cross, draw rig he'd cut from harness leather, and a Bowie knife in his right boot. He had no horse. He'd walked the last 60 miles from the Texas border through country, where a black man traveling alone was generally considered fair game for anyone wanting his weapons or his life. He hadn't been bothered. The reasons why would become clear to Boggy Depot's residents in the months ahead. His name. He told Angus McCrae when he came into the store to buy salt pork and coffee, was Jeremiah Walker. He'd served 3 years in the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, fought at the Battle of Honey Springs, been wounded twice, and mustered out at Fort Leavenworth in 1865 with a discharge paper, a back pay voucher the Army refused to honor, and his former owner's brand still visible on his left shoulder. McCrae looked him over once, noticed the way Walker stood with his back to the corner and his eyes on the door. He recognized the look of a man who'd long ago decided he'd never be taken alive. He counted out the goods without comment, even throwing in a small bag of dried apples. Years later, when McCrae was old and most of the people in this story were dead, he told a journalist from St. Louis that he'd known from the moment Walker walked into his store that the country was about to change, though he had no idea how much. The fragments of Walker's earlier life recovered, largely through the patient work of black historians at Howard University in the 1930s and 40s, paint a picture of a childhood designed to break a human being, yet somehow producing, through some combination of accident and fierce will, the opposite. He'd been born in 1846 on a cotton plantation in Adams County, Mississippi, the property of a planter named Josiah Whittington, who owned roughly 200 enslaved people and ran his operation on what he called scientific principles, meaning he'd read the agricultural journals of the day that concluded that productivity could be maximized by breaking up slave families and selling children once they reached working age, on the theory that workers without family ties were less likely to escape and more focused on their tasks. Walker's mother, whose name in the plantation ledgers was given only as Hannah, was sold south to Louisiana when Jeremiah was 9. He never saw her again. His father, whose identity Walker himself never knew with certainty, was probably a free blacksmith from Natchez, allowed brief, tightly controlled visits to the plantation, who vanished from local records in 1853, possibly murdered, possibly fled. At 11, Walker was sold to a cotton planter in northern Louisiana, the man whose initials would be burned into his shoulder, who treated him with casual brutality that was, by the standards of the time and place, neither unusual nor remarkable. Walker escaped at 15 in 1861 amid the chaos of the early war, making his way north through the Mississippi swamps to Union lines, where he was eventually directed to a recruiting station in Kansas, enlisting black soldiers for what would become the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. He served with distinction for 3 years. He learned to read in the regimental school, taught by a Quaker chaplain from Pennsylvania, who would later recall him in a published memoir as the most quietly intelligent young man the chaplain had ever met, with a memory that retained everything and an instinct for tactical situations that would have made him a senior officer in any army that allowed black men to wear officers' insignia. The Union Army did not allow this. Walker was discharged as a corporal, having been recommended for promotion to sergeant on 3 separate occasions and denied each time on grounds prohibited by the regulations of the period. What happened over the next 18 months in the territory between the Red River and the Canadian River is documented in fragments, in the records of the Choctaw Lighthorsmen, in dispatches of federal marshals at Fort Smith, in private correspondence of Texas cattlemen, and in oral histories that black families in eastern Oklahoma still tell their children, though now they tell them quietly, because the descendants of those who hunted Jeremiah Walker still live in those same counties, and old grudges in that country have a way of outliving the men who first conceived them. By the spring of 1868, Walker had assembled around him a band so improbable in its composition that federal authorities at first refused to believe the reports they were receiving. There were 7 black freedmen, all former Union soldiers like Walker himself, including a Tennessee man named Cassius Pettigrew, who'd been a regimental scout and could read sign on bare rock. There were 4 Comanche warriors led by a man called Tabananica, whose name meant Sound of the Sun, who'd lost his entire family to a Texas Ranger raid in 1864 and saw the new alliance as a continuation of his war against white settlers by other means. There were 3 Mexican brothers from the Nueces Strip, Ignacio, Ramon, and Severino Quintanilla, whose father had been hanged by Anglo vigilantes during the so-called Cart War, who brought with them the brutal efficiency of borderland feuds. There were 2 white men, both Confederate guerrillas who'd ridden with William Quantrill and had no place left in the post-war world, a Missourian named Ellis Tatum and a Kentuckian named Calvin H. Horton. There was an old Choctaw freedman named Solomon Beams, who'd been the slave of a Choctaw planter before the war and now served the band as cook, scout, and unofficial diplomat with the 5 civilized tribes. And there was a woman, which federal records found particularly hard to accept, a black woman of perhaps 25 named Delia Ransom, who'd escaped a Louisiana plantation at 15 and spent the war years working as a laundress for a Union cavalry regiment, where she'd learned to handle a pistol with both hands and read maps with the quick instinct of a born tactician. She rode with the band as an equal, planned several of its most successful raids, and was, according to the only surviving photograph of her, a woman of striking and severe beauty, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed focused on something 100 yards beyond whatever was actually in front of her. The gang didn't steal cattle, which is what made them dangerous. Cattle thieves were a known quantity in the territory, easy to organize against, easy to hunt down by the cattlemen's associations and the newly formed stock detective agencies. What Jeremiah Walker's band stole was money, in quantities no frontier outlaw had previously imagined possible. Their first major operation, in April 1868, was the robbery of a payroll wagon belonging to the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, which was trying to push its line west across the Indian Territory. The wagon carried 28 Zalosin in Union greenbacks meant to pay the railroad's construction crews. It was guarded by 12 armed men, including 4 Pinkerton agents brought in specifically because the railroad anticipated trouble. The wagon was hit at 300 in the morning by a force the surviving guards estimated at 30 riders, though Walker's entire band never numbered more than 20. The attack was over in less than 4 minutes. 3 guards were killed, including 2 Pinkertons. The rest were stripped of their weapons and tied to trees. The money was loaded onto pack mules and carried east into the Kiamichi Mountains, where it vanished into a network of caves the Choctaw freedmen had used as hiding places during the war. None of it was ever recovered. The surviving guards, when they were finally able to give coherent statements at Fort Smith, spoke of an attack that didn't feel like an attack at all. There had been no shouted demands, no warning shots, no announcement of intentions. Instead, a sudden silence, the kind that falls on a forest when a predator has entered it. The silence of every small animal holding its breath at once. The 2 lead horses pulling the wagon had collapsed simultaneously, killed by what proved on examination to be 2 perfectly placed rifle shots, fired from over 300 yards by marksmen the guards never saw. Then riders had emerged from the timber on both sides of the road, riding at a slow walk, their faces covered with dark cloth, their guns held ready but not pointed at anyone in particular. The way a man holds a gun when he's so certain of his ability to use it that he sees no need to threaten. 3 of the guards, including the senior Pinkerton, had tried to draw their weapons. They were shot dead before their hands completed the movement by riders no one saw aim. The other guards raised their hands. In a calm voice, one later described as sounding like a country schoolteacher instructing a particularly slow class. They were ordered to dismount, remove their gun belts, walk to designated trees, and put their wrists together behind the trunks. They complied. They were tied with cord, cut to exactly the right length in advance. They were searched, and any small valuables on their persons, watches, rings, small amounts of personal cash, were pointedly left untouched. Only the railroad money, the company money, was taken. One of the guards, a young Pinkerton from Pennsylvania on his first Western assignment, had started to cry. One of the masked riders dismounted, walked over, and offered him a sip from a flask of whiskey. The young man accepted. The rider patted him on the shoulder, returned to his horse, and rode away. By the time a passing freight wagon found them at dawn, the guards had been tied to their trees for nearly 5 hours. The only thing any of them could agree on with certainty was that the men who'd attacked them had not been ordinary outlaws. They had been, one of the guards said, soldiers, the kind who'd survived the war by becoming better at killing than the people trying to kill them, and had then decided, for reasons no one understood, to keep going. What disturbed the Pinkerton agency, more than the loss of the money, was the discovery. When the surviving guards were untied at dawn by a passing freight wagon, that each of them had been tagged with a small piece of paper pinned to his shirt. All the papers said the same thing in a careful schoolmaster's hand. What could have killed you? We chose not to. Tell your masters that the next time, the choice will be different. The Pinkerton agency didn't know what to do with this. The agency had been founded 20 years earlier by a Scottish abolitionist named Alan Pinkerton, who'd run safe houses on the Underground Railroad and who, in his younger days, would probably have understood what Jeremiah Walker was doing better than any man alive. But by 1868, Pinkerton had become the chief private police force for the American railroads and Eastern banking interests. His agents in the field were instructed to treat Walker's band as a simple criminal conspiracy and to bring in its members alive if possible, dead if not. The agency assigned its best man, a former Chicago detective named Patrick Donovan, to coordinate the hunt. Donovan was a hard man, an Irish immigrant who'd risen through the agency by being smarter and more ruthless than the men around him. He understood from the beginning that this would be no ordinary chase. He arrived at Fort Smith in May 1868, sat down with the federal marshal there, a former Union general named James Fagan, and asked a single question. How does a man hide 20 redders, 4 of them Comanche, in country where every cattleman, every settler, every passing teamster will report a strange face within a day? Fagan had no answer. Neither did Donovan. The answer, when it finally became clear 2 years later, would shock the federal government into a level of secrecy that kept the truth out of newspapers for the rest of the century. The answer was that Jeremiah Walker wasn't hiding. He was being protected by a network of people across 3 states and the Indian Territory who had decided, each in their own way and for their own reasons, that whatever Jeremiah Walker was doing was something that needed to be done. The first hint of this network came in the summer of 1868, when a Pinkerton informant in the Choctaw town of Dokesville reported that wagons of supplies had been moving in and out of the Kiamichi Mountains for months with the apparent knowledge and cooperation of the Choctaw Lithorsmen, who were turning a deliberate blind eye. Donovan investigated, found the informant murdered 3 days after filing his report. His body was left in the middle of Dokesville's main street, with a single playing card pinned to his chest, the King of Spades. No one in Dokesville had seen anything. No one knew anything. When Donovan threatened to bring in federal troops, the Choctaw chief, a man named Allen Wright, a graduate of Union College, who'd once translated the Bible into the Choctaw language, looked at him with the patient contempt of a man who'd been dealing with white officials his entire life, and said only that the Choctaw Nation was a sovereign government under the treaties of 1866. That federal troops could not enter without Choctaw consent, and that consent would not be given. The implication was clear. Walker had the protection of the Choctaw government, or at least enough of its officials to make that protection effective. Donovan returned to Fort Smith and sent a long telegram to Pinkerton headquarters in Chicago. The response from Alan Pinkerton himself, a copy of which survives in the agency's archives, was one of the strangest documents in American law enforcement history. It instructed Donovan to proceed with the investigation, but to use particular discretion in any actions that might bring the matter to public attention. Pinkerton himself, the old abolitionist, seemed to understand that something complicated was happening on the southwestern frontier. Something that didn't fit neatly into categories of law and crime, and was reluctant to bring the full weight of his agency down on it without first knowing what he would be destroying. If you're still listening, and I hope you are, take a moment right now to hit that like button, because the algorithm only shows this kind of buried American history to people who actively engage with it. The families who've spent 150 years trying to keep this story buried have done a very effective job. Every like, every comment, every share helps another person discover what really happened in the territory in the years after the Civil War. And if you have a theory about what was really going on in the Kiamichi Mountains, leave it in the comments. Because what we're about to discover is that the truth was stranger and darker than even Patrick Donovan was prepared to imagine. In the autumn of 1868, Walker's band struck again, this time hitting a stagecoach carrying gold from the Choctaw Nation's annuity payment, money the federal government owed the tribe under the Treaty of 1866 and had finally agreed to pay in coin, rather than depreciated paper currency the tribes had learned to refuse. The coach carried 19 thousands in gold double eagles. It was guarded by a detachment of the 6th United States Cavalry. The cavalry detachment was wiped out, 8 troopers killed in a single volley from rifles fired from positions on both sides of the road. The gold was taken, but that wasn't what made the robbery famous. What made it famous was what Walker did next. Within 2 weeks, every Choctaw freedman family in the eastern half of the Choctaw Nation had received, by means no investigation could ever quite trace, a small leather pouch containing exactly 29 in gold double eagles. There were nearly 700 such families in the affected area. The math worked out almost exactly to the amount stolen, with a small remainder the freedmen insisted had been used to buy school books for the children. Federal investigators who interviewed these families found, to their fury, that none of the recipients would say a word about who'd brought the gold or how it had arrived. The pouches simply appeared on doorsteps in the night with no note, no explanation. When pressed, the freedmen said only that the Lord worked in mysterious ways, and looked at federal agents with expressions combining politeness, patience, and a deep, ancient amusement the agents found impossible to penetrate. Patrick Donovan understood, when he read the reports, exactly what had happened. Walker wasn't a thief. He wasn't even, in the conventional sense, an outlaw. He was a redistributor, an inverted Robin Hood operating in a post-war landscape where the federal government had failed in its most basic obligations to the people it had freed, and where railroads and cattle barons were busily seizing every acre of land and every dollar of wealth they could get their hands on before anyone could organize effective resistance. Walker was the resistance. By the spring of 1869, the band had carried out at least 11 major operations, including the robbery of 2 more railroad payrolls, the looting of a Wells Fargo Express office in Texarkana, the interception of a herd of Texas cattle being driven north to Kansas by a syndicate of speculators who'd cheated a number of Comanche families out of their treaty grazing rights, and a daring raid on the Bank of Sherman, Texas, which had foreclosed on dozens of small farms owned by freedmen and Mexican families during the Panic of 1867. The bank's vault was emptied of 41 zalozen. The bank's records, including foreclosure files, were burned in the street. Within a month, deeds to the foreclosed properties began appearing in the mail of the dispossessed families, accompanied by notarized statements indicating the bank had reconsidered its position and was returning the land. The notary stamps were forged, but the deeds themselves were genuine. They'd been removed from the bank's vault during the robbery, and someone with extensive legal knowledge had transferred them properly through the county recorder's office, using a clerk who'd been bribed, blackmailed, or otherwise persuaded to cooperate. Federal authorities tried to challenge the deeds in court. The court, presided over by a judge appointed during Reconstruction and sympathetic to the freedmen, ruled that the transfers were legal on their face and that the federal government had no standing to contest them. The dispossessed families kept their land. The bank, ruined by the loss and the publicity, closed its doors within 6 months. Patrick Donovan, reading reports in his Fort Smith office, began to develop what he later described in a private letter to his wife as a peculiar admiration for his quarry, an admiration he found morally troubling and professionally dangerous. He wrote that he'd begun to understand why Walker had become a folk hero in the territory, why songs about him sung by black families in the Cotton Bottoms had begun to spread to cattle camps and railroad work crews, why even some white settlers, particularly small farmers and Confederate veterans who'd themselves been ruined by the war, were starting to view Walker not as an outlaw, but as a man taking back some small fraction of what had been stolen from everyone who went winch enough to be on the winning side on the winning side of the new American economy. Donovan understood all of this, and he also understood that his job was to capture or kill Jeremiah Walker, and that his job was not negotiable. In the summer of 1869, Donovan made his first serious attempt. He assembled a force of 40 men, including 20 Pinkerton agents, 12 Texas Rangers under the command of a notorious captain named Leander McNelly, and 8 federal marshals from Fort Smith. The force was equipped with new Henry, repeating rifles, plenty of ammunition, and the best horses the agency could buy. They'd received intelligence from an informant, a freedman named Cyrus Burdett, who'd briefly ridden with Walker's band and been turned by the offer of a federal pardon and $1,000 in cash, that Walker's main camp was in a hidden valley in the Kialmachi Mountains, called by the Choctaw the Valley of the Whispering Pines, accessible only through a single narrow defile the band, kept guarded day and night. Donovan's force rode out from Fort Smith on the morning of June 3, 1869. They were to rendezvous with Burdett at a crossroads near the town of Tuskahoma, where he would lead them by a back route into the valley. Bypassing the main defile, they reached the crossroads at dusk. Burdett was waiting for them. He was sitting against a tree, his hands tied behind his back, his throat cut from ear to ear, his eyes still open. Pinned to his shirt was a playing card, the King of Spades. Donovan understood instantly what had happened. Burdett had been doubled. He'd pretended to take the federal money, while reporting everything he learned back to Walker. Walker had used him to lure the federal force into a trap. Donovan ordered his men to spread out into a defensive perimeter and prepare for an attack. The attack came at moonrise. That night, the moon was 3/4 full, rising late and bright through the pine tops. The men who survived what happened next would never again be able to sit comfortably in a dark forest, or hear horses' hooves on pine needles, or smell wood smoke on a summer night without feeling the hair on their arms stand up. It came from every direction at once, from positions the band had clearly prepared days in advance, with crossfires that pinned the federal force in a small clearing surrounded by dense timber. The first volley killed 6 men in a single breath, men who'd been standing or kneeling in positions they'd imagined offered some protection, but that had in fact been chosen for them by marksmen in the trees, who'd used the federal force's own defensive instincts to guide them into the kill zone. Return fire was wild. Federal men fired at muzzle flashes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that moved between shots, never twice from the same position. Captain McNelly of the Texas Rangers, a famously aggressive officer who'd spent 4 years fighting Mexican bandits along the Rio Grande, tried to lead a charge into the timber on the south side of the clearing. He was shot through the neck before he'd taken 5 steps, dying slowly over the next 10 minutes while his men crouched behind fallen logs, watched him bleed, and couldn't move to help him without drawing the same fire. The voice of Jeremiah Walker himself, or someone speaking for him, called out from somewhere in the darkness, in English clear enough to carry across the clearing, telling the federal men to lay down their weapons, stand up with their hands empty, and they wouldn't be killed. Donovan, bleeding from a shoulder wound that nearly killed him, made the decision he'd second guess for the rest of his life and ordered his men to surrender. The fight lasted less than an hour. When it was over, 16 of Donovan's 40 men were dead, 12 more were wounded. The remainder, including Donovan himself, hit in the shoulder by a rifle ball, were stripped of their weapons, their horses, and their uniforms, and left to walk the 40 miles back to Fort Smith in their underclothes. None of Walker's band, as far as anyone could tell, had been killed or even wounded. When Donovan staggered into Fort Smith 3 days later, sunburned and dehydrated, with a tag pinned to his bare chest reading the same 5 words that had appeared on the wagon guards a year earlier. Federal Marshal James Fagan sent a telegram to Washington requesting authorization to raise a force of regular Army cavalry, at least a regiment, to clear the territory of what he called, in the language of the time, the Negro Insurrectionary Band led by the Freedman Walker. The War Department's response, when it finally came, was to deny the request. The reasons for the denial wouldn't become clear for another 50 years, when the relevant files were finally opened to historians. The truth, which the War Department understood and James Fagan did not, was that Jeremiah Walker's operations had become entangled in a much larger political conflict, one involving Reconstruction policies of the Grant administration, the legal status of freedmen in Western territories, and the desperate efforts of railroads and cattle interests to seize control of the Indian Territory before any effective federal authority could be established there. Sending a regiment of cavalry into the territory to hunt down a band that included Comanche warriors and was protected by the Choctaw government would, the War Department feared, trigger exactly the kind of larger Indian war General Sherman was trying to avoid. It would also, less officially but perhaps more importantly, draw national attention to the fact that the federal government was failing catastrophically to protect freedmen and was in many respects allowing the South to reimpose a system of de facto slavery through the convict lease system. The Black Codes and a rising tide of Klan violence federal authorities were either unable or unwilling to suppress. Walker was an embarrassment. The cavalry would make him a martyr. Better to let the Pinkertons handle it quietly, out of the public eye, and hope the problem would eventually solve itself through the slow attrition of arrests, betrayals, and natural causes that eventually consumed every outlaw band. This was the policy the Grant administration adopted. Patrick Donovan was instructed to continue his pursuit with whatever resources the agency could provide, and to keep the matter out of newspapers. Donovan, who'd nearly died in the Valley of the Whispering Pines, accepted his orders with a grim sense of having finally understood the kind of country he was working for. What followed were 3 years of a strange, slow, deeply secret war fought in the canyons, bottoms, and small towns of the Indian Territory, the Texas borderlands, and the cotton districts of southwestern Arkansas. Walker's band continued to operate, hitting selected targets with surgical precision, never striking the same place twice, never killing more than the operation required, always leaving behind their playing cards and tagged messages. They robbed 2 more bank vaults, 3 more railroad payrolls, an Army quartermaster wagon carrying 60,000 in cash for frontier garrisons, and, most spectacularly, in October 1870, attacked and looted a riverboat called the Memphis Belle as it lay tied up at a wood landing on the Arkansas River, taking an estimated 90,000 in cash and bullion the boat was carrying south for a consortium of New Orleans cotton factors. In each case, the proceeds vanished into the network of caves, sympathetic farmers, and quietly bribed officials Walker had constructed across 3 states. In each case, within weeks of the robbery, freedmen families, dispossessed Indian families, ruined small farmers, and Mexican families displaced by Anglo cattle barons would receive small unmarked packages of cash. Deeds returned from foreclosure, livestock stolen from them years earlier reappearing at their gates with no explanation. Walker had built, in effect, a parallel economy, a redistributive system funded by armed expropriation from the largest concentrations of capital in the post-war economy, and operated through a network of mutual aid that crossed every line of race, religion, and language in the borderlands. Patrick Donovan understood all of this, and the more he understood it, the more he found himself, against his will and against his orders, beginning to admire the man he'd been sent to destroy. He wrote in his journal, which his granddaughter would discover in a Chicago attic in 1947 and eventually deposit at the Newberry Library. That Walker was the most dangerous man in America, not because he was killing white people, but because he was demonstrating that an alternative to the developing American economy was possible, and that this alternative could be defended by men and women willing to die for it. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Kiamichi country intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The thing that finally broke the band, the thing no investigation by Pinkertons or federal marshals had been able to accomplish, was something no one had foreseen. It wasn't betrayal, though there had been many attempted betrayals over the years. It wasn't military force, though Donovan continued to assemble and dispatch posses with grim regularity. It was, in the end, a combination of personal grief and strategic miscalculation, the same combination that has destroyed every armed resistance movement in human history sooner or later. In the spring of 1872, Delia Ransom was pregnant. The father was Jeremiah Walker himself, with whom Delia had been intimate, records suggest, since at least 1868, though their relationship had been kept carefully concealed, even from the rest of the band. Both because Walker believed personal attachments made a man vulnerable, and because Delia herself had insisted on operating as an equal commander, not as a wife or consort. The pregnancy changed everything. Walker, who'd survived a childhood in slavery, 3 years of war, and 4 years as the most hunted man in the Western Territories, found himself for the first time confronting the possibility of something he'd never allowed himself to imagine: a future, a child, a family. Records suggest that he and Delia began in the summer of 1872 to plan their withdrawal from the band. They wouldn't abandon operations entirely, but would shift to a quieter role, advisory rather than operational, allowing younger men like Cass's Pettigrew and Tabananaka's nephew, a young Comanche warrior named Poitz Quasho, to take over leadership. Walker and Delia would relocate with the child to a small farm in the Choctaw Nation, quietly purchased in Solomon Beam's name, where they would try to live out whatever years remained to them as ordinary people. It was a beautiful plan. It was a sentimental plan. It was, as Walker himself probably understood, a plan no man in his position had any right to make. The plan was discovered by Patrick Donovan in October 1872. Through a piece of dumb luck so improbable that Donovan himself, in his journal, attributed it to the direct intervention of God. in whom he had not previously believed. A Choctaw freedman named Ezekiel Folsom, distantly related to saloon owner Pushmataha Folsom and to the Choctaw chief, had been arrested in Fort Smith on a charge of horse theft. To save himself from a long sentence, he offered information. He'd heard from his cousin, who worked at the recorder's office in Tuskahoma, that a deed had recently been registered for a small farm near the town of Atoka in the name of Solomon Beams. Folsom didn't know who Solomon Beams was. He didn't know why this information should be valuable. He offered it as part of a list of small gossip he hoped would buy his freedom. Donovan, sitting across the desk from him, recognized the name instantly. He'd seen it in reports for years, mentioned in passing as one of Walker's associates. The deed was the first concrete connection between Walker's band and a piece of identifiable fixed property anywhere in the territory. It was a thread. Donovan pulled it. What he found when he pulled the thread was the entire pattern. The farm at Atoka had been purchased with cash. The cash had been deposited in a bank in Sherman, Texas, by a freight agent named Augustus Blandon. Blandon had received the cash from a Choctaw merchant named Cyrus Pitchlin. Pitchlin was the brother-in-law of Pushmataha Folsom, the saloon owner in Boggy Depot. Pushmataha Folsom was the principal supplier of whiskey to the Kiamichi Mountains. By following the money, Donovan was able over 3 months to map the entire commercial infrastructure of Walker's network, every saloon keeper, every freight agent, every bribed clerk, every sympathetic farmer who'd been moving supplies and information for the band for the past 4 years. He didn't move on any of them. Instead, he watched, he waited, he compiled. By February 1873, Donovan had assembled a list of 147 individuals across 3 states and the Indian Territory who were materially involved in supporting Walker's operations. He'd also identified with reasonable confidence the location of the farm at Atoka where Walker and Delia Ransom were planning to retire after the birth of their child, expected in the late spring. Donovan did something that no Pinkerton agent had done before. He went directly to Alan Pinkerton himself in Chicago and laid out the entire case. He explained what Walker had built. He explained what the network was, what it did, why freedmen Indians, Mexican families, and ruined white farmers were protecting it. He explained that any attempt to destroy the band by force, even now, with all this intelligence in hand, would create martyrs and harden the network into a permanent insurgency the federal government would never be able to suppress without a level of violence politically impossible. He proposed instead a different approach to make Walker an offer. The offer, as Donovan finally presented it through an intermediary in March 1873, was this: Walker and Delia Ransom could keep the farm at Atoka. They could keep their unborn child. They would receive federal pardons signed personally by President Grant for all crimes committed by them or any member of their band during years of operation. In exchange, they would disband the band, return to private life, and use their remaining moral authority among freedmen and Indian peoples of the territory to discourage any further organized resistance to the federal government and the developing American economy. They would, in effect, sell out. The intermediary was Solomon Beams. The old Choctaw freedman Cook Donovan had been holding in protective custody at Fort Smith for 2 months without filing charges. Donovan had treated Beams well, fed him at the marshal's table, allowed him to write letters to his family. He'd also explained, with patient clarity, what would happen to the entire network of 147 people, including Beams' own wife and 3 children, if the offer was rejected. Beams understood. He carried the offer back into the Kiamichi Mountains. He delivered it to Walker personally in the Valley of the Whispering Pines on a cold March evening in 1873. What was said between them isn't recorded, because Solomon Beams refused, for the rest of his long life, to discuss it with any white man, and the only people he ever told the full story to were 3 black ministers in eastern Oklahoma, all of whom died without writing it down. What is known is that Walker accepted the offer. He understood, the way Donovan had hoped he would, that the cost of refusal would be paid not by him, but by everyone who'd stood with him for the past 5 years, and that he had no right to ask them to pay that cost for the sake of his own pride or continued resistance. The plan was set for the night of April 17, 1873. Walker would meet Donovan at a remote cabin near the Texas border, where formal pardons would be signed and disbandment would begin. Walker would come alone. Donovan would come alone. The agreement was witnessed by Solomon Beams and by a Choctaw judge named Allen Wright, the same Allen Wright who'd been chief of the nation when Donovan first investigated the Dokesville murder 5 years earlier, and who'd agreed, after considerable pressure, to serve as guarantor of the federal government's good faith. Walker arrived at the cabin at midnight on April 17, alone on a horse, carrying no weapons. Donovan was waiting. The pardons were signed. The 2 men shared a bottle of whiskey, the first time, Walker remarked, he'd ever drunk with a white lawman. They talked for hours about the war, the territory, the future. Donovan wrote in his journal that Walker spoke of his unborn child with a softness he hadn't expected from a man who'd killed perhaps 50 other men over his career. He wrote that Walker had asked him at one point, during the long night, whether he thought the Grant administration would actually honor the pardon, whether it would hold in any court, whether the land at Atoka would remain in his name if some ambitious prosecutor challenged it 5 years from now. Donovan had said, honestly, that he didn't know. He said he'd done everything within his authority to make the agreement binding. The pardon bore the president's signature. The Choctaw Judge Allen Wright had agreed to serve as witness and guarantor, but that the United States government wasn't in the habit of keeping promises to black men or Indians, and Walker would be a fool to trust any piece of paper from Washington. Walker smiled at this, a small, private smile Donovan would remember for the rest of his life, and said only that he was tired, that he'd been tired for 10 years, and that he'd decided a foolish trust was preferable to the alternative spending the rest of his life running from men like Donovan, raising his child on the run, watching his child grow up, expecting to be killed the way his father and grandfather had been killed. He said he'd made peace with the possibility the pardon wouldn't hold, and if it didn't, at least he would have tried. He said this was what he was giving up the band for. Not the farm, not the pardons, but the chance, however small, of a life not defined by the expectation of violence. They parted before dawn. Walker rode north toward the Choctaw Nation and the farm at Atoka, where Delia was waiting. Donovan rode east toward Fort Smith with the signed agreement in his saddlebag. What happened next was something Patrick Donovan hadn't anticipated, and no one in the federal government had anticipated, demonstrating with terrible finality that the network Walker had built wasn't actually under his control, and perhaps never had been. The 17 men who'd been hunting Walker for the previous 6 weeks, the Pinkerton agents, Texas Rangers, and federal deputies whose bodies the marshal would find a few weeks later, arranged in their perfect circle around the dying campfire, hadn't known about Donovan's negotiation. They'd been operating under older orders to capture or kill Walker on sight. They'd been close. They'd picked up his trail 2 days before the meeting with Donovan, closing in on the cabin when Walker rode away at dawn. They caught up with Walker at mid-morning on April 18 in a small ravine about 12 miles south of the Red River in Texas. They surrounded him. They demanded his surrender. Walker, carrying no weapons, because he'd ridden to the meeting with Donovan unarmed as a gesture of good faith, raised his hands and showed them the signed federal pardon. The posse's leader, a Texas Ranger captain named Moriah Hollister, took the pardon, read it, and threw it on the ground. He told Walker he didn't recognize the authority of any pardon issued by the Grant administration, that his orders came from the state of Texas and from the Cattlemen's Associations funding his work, and those orders hadn't changed. He gave Walker 30 seconds to draw a weapon and defend himself. Walker, still unarmed, simply stood there. Hollister shot him through the chest from 12 feet. Walker fell. Hollister rode forward, dismounted, and put a second bullet through Walker's head as he lay dying in the dust. He then ordered the body hung from the nearest tree as a warning. The body was hung. The posse rode away. They didn't know what they'd done. They didn't know about the network. They didn't know about Delia Ransom and the unborn child waiting at the farm in Atoka. They didn't know they'd just executed the only man in 3 states who'd been holding back something far older and far more dangerous than any organized outlaw band. They found out within 48 hours. Cass's Pettigrew was first to reach the body. Alerted by a Comanche scout shadowing Walker as he rode north from the meeting with Donovan, Pettigrew cut the body down. He buried it in an unmarked grave in a place never discovered. He then sent runners in every direction across the network. The runners carried no message except a date, a place, and a deck of playing cards from which 17 specific cards had been removed. The remaining band members and inner circle of the support network understood. They knew what was being asked. Within 6 weeks, every man who'd been part of the posse that killed Jeremiah Walker, including Moriah Hollister, had been hunted down and killed. Each shot once between the eyes, each left holding one of the 17 missing playing cards. Each arranged in a pattern meaningless to federal investigators who found the bodies. But when the cards were eventually combined and read in the order the men died, spelled out in a code based on a Comanche counting system, the simple words, "This debt is paid. Patrick Donovan." When he finally understood what had happened, requested a leave of absence from the Pinkerton agency. He went to Chicago, spent 3 weeks drinking alone in a hotel room, and wrote a long letter to Alan Pinkerton, explaining he was resigning, that he could no longer continue in a profession that had used him, against his knowledge and explicit assurances, to lure a man to his death under false promise of a federal pardon. Pinkerton refused to accept the resignation. He explained in a private meeting, recorded in Donovan's journal, that Moriah Hollister hadn't been operating under federal orders, that his actions were unauthorized and, in a strict legal sense, a state crime, and that the federal government couldn't be held responsible. Donovan understood this was true in the narrowest legal sense and false in every meaningful sense. He understood the federal government had created the conditions under which Hollister could believe his orders hadn't changed. By failing to communicate the pardon to field operatives, by failing to coordinate various agencies hunting Walker, by failing fundamentally to want Walker to live. He understood Walker had been killed not by Hollister, who'd merely fired the bullets, but by the United States government, which had decided an alternative American economy couldn't be allowed to exist. He stayed at the agency because he had nowhere else to go and a family to support. But he never worked another case in the territory, and he never spoke to Alan Pinkerton again except through subordinates. He died in 1907 in Chicago of pneumonia at 73. His last words, according to his daughter present at the bedside, were the name, Jeremiah, repeated twice. What happened to Delia Ransom and the child? You may ask. What happened to the network of 147 people who'd supported Walker for 5 years? What happened to the farm at Atoka, where Walker had planned to live out his years as an ordinary man? The answers survive in pieces, in family histories, in oral traditions of freedmen, Choctaw, and Comanche, but have never been fully assembled, and probably never will be. Delia Ransom gave birth to a son in May 1873. She named him Jeremiah after his father. She left the Choctaw Nation within a month, traveling first to New Orleans and then by ship to Liberia, where a small community of black expatriates from the American South had been trying for 50 years to build a free republic on West Africa's coast. She arrived in Monrovia in November 1873. She lived there under the name Delia Walker until her death in 1904. Her son grew up in Liberia, was educated at the College of West Africa, became a lawyer, and eventually returned to the United States in the 1910s, becoming one of the early organizers of what would become the NAACP. He died in 1949 in Atlanta, having lived his entire life without publicly acknowledging his father's identity. Though he wrote in a private letter to his own son that he'd been told the story at age 12 by his mother and had carried it every day of his life thereafter. The network of 147 people was never prosecuted. Donovan, in his last act of conscience as a Pinkerton agent, destroyed the list. He burned it himself in the fireplace of his Chicago hotel room the week after learning of Walker's death. The names existed nowhere else. The men and women on the list lived out their lives in their towns and on their farms across the territory. And the support they'd given Walker remained for most a secret, shared only with children and grandchildren. In private, late at night, when the white world wasn't listening, the farm at Atoka was burned to the ground in 1875 by night riders associated with the early Ku Klux Klan, who'd heard rumors it had once belonged to Walker and wished to make a statement. The rumors were never confirmed. The land was sold for taxes in 1878 to a white settler from Kansas who had no idea what he was buying. The settler, Ebenezer Crowley, found, when he plowed the south field for the first spring planting, a small leather pouch buried 6 inches below the surface. Inside were 20 gold double eagles, the last of the Choctaw annuity gold from the 1868 robbery, which Walker had buried on the farm he'd hoped to live on. Perhaps as insurance, perhaps simply from the habit of a man who'd spent his entire life expecting everything could be taken from him at any moment. Crowley sold the gold to a bank in Atoka, used the money to buy a team of mules, and lived a long, uneventful life on the land where Jeremiah Walker had hoped to raise his son. He never knew what he'd stumbled onto. He died in 1909, having mentioned the gold to no one but his wife. The story of Jeremiah Walker, the runaway slave who built the most dangerous gang the Western Territories had ever seen, was systematically suppressed by the federal government. The Pinkerton Agency, the cattle interests that profited from his death, and the dominant historical narrative of the American West, which had no place for a black man on horseback with a Spencer carbine and a network of 147 people across 3 states willing to die to protect him. The story survived in fragments in songs black families in eastern Oklahoma still sing without quite knowing what they mean, in playing cards that occasionally appear in antique markets of Fort Smith and Texarkana with strange numerical markings on their backs, in a small obelisk in a forgotten cemetery in the Choctaw Nation that bears no name, but is decorated every April 18 with a single bouquet of wild prairie flowers, placed by hands never seen and after 150 years, must now belong to the great-grandchildren of people who knew the truth and refused to let it die. This mystery shows us that the history we're taught is rarely the history that actually happened, and that the most dangerous men in any society aren't those who kill and steal for personal gain, but those who refuse to accept that the world as they find it is the only world that can exist. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Was Jeremiah Walker an outlaw, a hero, or something more complicated than either word can capture? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next